of the black intellectual, the National Baptist Association became known as the denomination of the masses. Both the AME and Black Baptist Church were racially conscious, unashamedly black, and unapologetically Christian, and sought recognition of the full humanity of its members. For both denominations, the authority of Scripture demanded a necessary stand against, as well as an inevitable separation from white supremacy.
The National Baptist Convention was founded in 1895 in Atlanta at Friendship Baptist Church, consequently the same church where Spelman College was founded. It actually was the only convention. I mean, there were some splinterings, but for the most part, it was the only Black Baptist convention up until about 1915. The desire to start a Black Baptist convention wasn't because of doctrine or theology. They didn't break away from these white Baptist missionary societies because they saw them becoming, quote unquote, modernized by, theologically liberal, seminaries and scholars. White paternalism and racism ultimately led to the formulation of the National Baptist Convention USA. It wasn't a debate over orthodoxy and the core tenets of the Christian faith. That wasn't the issue that caused the schisms and that led to the ultimate formulation of the National Baptist Convention. It was orthopraxy.
Through the early 1900s, National Baptist numbers far exceed African Methodists, maybe 5 to 1. That's because they had a way of demonstrating that anybody is somebody in the kingdom. For instance, many National Baptist pastors were not required to have seminary training. They had a calling and felt the Spirit move upon their hearts. They could go and preach and pastor in a church.
Beyond the debates around seminary or white supremacy, the National Baptists would also have to contend with the issue of gender. The women of the NBC sought recognition of their voice and their right to participate in spreading the gospel.
The National Baptist Convention, though large and in charge in many ways, had its problems, and Nannie Helen Burroughs was quick to call those problems out. Isaiah Robertson, in his book on the Black Church, says that in many ways Nannie Helen Burroughs had a call of God to preach, but could not do so in the NBC.
Black women, although they made up the majority of the Black Baptist Church, they were often overlooked. They were often, sort of marginalized and ostracized even in a lot of ways. And so you didn't have a lot of, Black women serving as leaders, prominent leaders within these disparate Baptist groups, really until, Nannie Helen Burroughs stepped up and rectified that. In 1900, Nannie Helen Burroughs at the National Baptist Convention gathering gives a speech, famous speech, how the sisters are hindered from helping. And in this speech, she calls the men of the convention to recognize that there are Black women ready to lead, ready to serve, ready to sort of take the baton and, do what a lot of men were unwilling or unable to do. Ultimately, though, the National Baptist Convention as an institution agreed. And that's where you get the creation of the Women's Convention, because they agreed and they were smart in doing so, because the Women's Convention served as a huge source of fundraising, a huge source of education for Black women, and a huge source of self-esteem for Black women, and that boded well for the overall convention. So ultimately, the group became one of the largest and most influential Black women's groups in the United States, with a membership of nearly 1 million women in 1903 and 1.5 million by 1907.
One of the understudied elements of the Black church is in some ways the more conservative, or to borrow from Esau, Black ecclesial tradition tensions within the Black church, in particular the National Baptist Convention. The emergence of the Progressive National Baptist Convention came about for a number of reasons, but chief among them, to my thinking, is the tension between the older Joseph H. Jackson, president of the National Convention, also a Republican, who believed in a more kind of Washingtonian approach to these issues, and the younger Martin Luther King Jr., who was trained more in liberal spaces and believed that direct action, nonviolent action, was the way to advance desegregation and integration in the nation.
This whole notion of like the black church being this, as an institution, being this stalwart ally of Dr. King throughout the entire civil rights struggle is just not necessarily the case. It's more complex and nuanced than that. When Dr. King comes to Chicago, pressure was placed upon Black Baptist churches not to harbor him, not to support him, to ignore him.
Up until recently, the difference was about how to bring about justice in America, not whether or not the Bible is trustworthy, or not whether or not God made himself known in a person named Jesus who was crucified, died, and was buried, but early Sunday morning got with all power in his hands. So when we say progressive, historically it wasn't progressive in the sense of challenging the orthodox claims of Christology and ecclesiology. It shared with the National Baptists those central beliefs propounded, expounded upon in the Articles of Faith. The distinction is really about how do these folks who have the same faith commitments bring those faith commitments to bear on injustice in the world. And I think the NBC and the PNBC are still wrestling with those same set of questions today.